I imagine your goal probably is to maximize muscle growth. That's why you clicked on the video. You want to achieve your dream physique as fast as possible. If that's the case, do not fall for the low volume propaganda that is being spread on social media by many influencers. Over the past few weeks or months, I have seen way too many YouTube thumbnails with the phrase less is more, less is not more is more. Trust, as someone who has fallen into this trap, do not fall for this. In the past, I even made a video about how low volume is better because I actually fell for the hype myself. The video is now privated as I don't want anyone to take the advice, but I have to admit I was wrong, and I don't want you to fall for the hype the same way I have. In this video, I want to show you why low volume is worse for specifically maximizing muscle growth. Quickly about me, I have been lifting for about 8.5 years and have been studying this for the same amount of time. At 15, I started my lifting journey and was hugely inspired by body transformations on YouTube like that of David Lade. I wanted to achieve a similar transformation as fast as possible. As of right now, this is what my physique looks like. Am I an expert like Dr. Eric Helms, Menno Henselmans, Greg Knuckles, or other exercise scientists? No, not by a long shot, so rather listen to them. But I will try my best to convey their research and what their arguments are for why more volume is generally better and why lower volume is generally worse. So, part 1: why anecdotes and personal experience matter very little when it comes to figuring out what maximizes muscle growth. One thing I often hear people say is that ever since they started doing low volume, they made the best gains of their lives and then used short-term strength gains as a proxy for hypertrophy. This is not a smart way of assessing muscle growth. In the long term, hypertrophy and strength are very highly correlated. That's true. In the short term, however, neuromuscular adaptations and skill acquisition play a much bigger role. On top of that, your subjective experience of how much muscle mass you think you're gaining can be influenced by many things, for example, confirmation bias. That means if you are convinced low volume is better, you might seek, interpret, favor, and recall information that confirms this belief. For example, because of your short-term strength increases, you think that you're making great muscle gains as well. Then the next thing, feelings. Because if you do low volume, you tend to be more recovered, therefore you generally feel better and you are more motivated, which could lead you to conclude that low volume is better since it just feels better. And then your subjective experience of how much muscle mass you think you're gaining can also be influenced by almost an unlimited amount of confounders. For example, if you start eating better, sleeping better, training better, or improve your form, these could all also have had a meaningful impact on your increased muscle gains, which means they are not necessarily attributable to your low volume training approach. Part 2. Let me present the low volume argument in the best faith possible. So we all want myofibrillar hypertrophy. That's the hypertrophy of the actual contractile tissue in our muscles. Any increase in this contractile tissue should increase strength, as we have more contractile tissue. Therefore, an increase in muscle size that's not accompanied by an increase in strength cannot be myofibrillar hypertrophy. And since the latest meta-regression exploring the relationship between volume and strength shows that 5 direct sets per muscle group per week seem to maximize strength, that means that any seeming increase in muscle mass past 5 direct sets per muscle group per week, as the meta-regression of volume for hypertrophy seems to suggest, are not in fact myofibrillar hypertrophy, but rather edema, muscle swelling, or sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Part 3. What they get right versus what they get wrong. So let's go over what they get right first. So first of all, we actually do primarily care about myofibrillar hypertrophy. So the actual hypertrophy of the actual contractile tissue. Second, if we change nothing but increase our contractile tissue, we should have a greater strength potential. And then thirdly, The latest meta-regression on volume for strength does show that 5 direct sets per muscle group per week are best for strength, but only in the short term. So now let's go over what they get wrong. 5 direct sets per muscle group per week are not enough to maximize muscle growth, and neither strength. In the short term, skill acquisition and neuromuscular adaptations outpace myofibrillar hypertrophy, and since most studies in the meta-regression were short-term studies, the data rather shows that gains in skill acquisition and neuromuscular adaptations plateau at 5 direct sets per muscle group per week, meaning you wouldn't increase your skill acquisition or neuromuscular adaptations above 5 direct sets per muscle group per week. Stronger by Science in an article also pointed out that if you take these studies included in the meta-regression on volume for hypertrophy and looked at what their data suggest regarding the relationship between volume and strength, strength does in fact increase with more volume. Now, something else they get wrong is that the increased muscle growth observed above 5 direct sets per muscle group per week are not confounded by edema or muscle swelling. So that's often they say, the low volume guys say that any muscle growth observed above 5 direct sets per muscle group per week are not actual muscle growth in terms of myofibrillar hypertrophy, but instead edema or muscle swelling. But edema and muscle swelling are back to baseline after 24 hours in resistance trained subjects, regardless of volume, as this recent study showed. Apart from that, in the studies included in the meta-analyses, the measurements were taken 24 to 72 hours after their last training session. So, edema and muscle swelling could not have had an impact on muscle mass measurements. That means the meta-regression stands. Generally, for most people, all else equal, doing more sets should lead to a greater stimulus and therefore more hypertrophy. Now, I should mention that the stimulus obviously is subject to diminishing returns, meaning every additional set adds incrementally less stimulus than the ones before. But now you might still be asking yourself, something that I've always been asking myself, how can an increase in myofibrillar hypertrophy not lead to increased strength? The reason is actually fairly simple. It's because of fatigue. Fatigue can mask strength potential. That's why powerlifters do a taper before competitions. But this fatigue does not hinder hypertrophy, as the meta-regression showed. Part 4. What actually maximizes hypertrophy? The way you maximize hypertrophy is by maximizing the stimulus under the curve. Your muscle fibers get stimulated to grow if they receive a ton of mechanical tension. The more muscle fibers you recruit, the more muscle fibers will be exposed to this tension and therefore receive a stimulus to grow. You can increase tension by maximizing the internal force your muscles have to produce. That could be through increasing the weight or by changing your form to make the exercise more difficult. The closer you train to failure, the more high threshold motor units need to be recruited and the more of them will be exposed to high tension, creating the stimulus. The more sets you perform, the more stimulus under the curve you will build up. Now imagine a curve that shows you the stimulus over time. Your goal should be to maximize this curve. So how do you do that? By training closer to failure and by doing more volume. Part 5. How much volume should you do? Obviously, there is a practical limit. The studies included in the meta-regression often only trained a few muscle groups at a time and not the whole body. You obviously can't train every major muscle group with 30 to 40 or more sets per week. That means the goal should be to try and maximize the stimulus over time while staying injury and pain free. You will have to find out where that is for you. I recommend starting out doing low volume, maybe 2 sets per exercise, and 6 and 6 to 8 sets per muscle group per week and build that up over time. And you should obviously train these sets close to failure, so meaning 1 rep in reserve or right to failure. Now, the repeated bout effects will ensure that the same stimulus will be less damaging over time, which means you should be able to do more volume over time while incurring less damage. Over weeks and months, your recovery capacity should go up, allowing you to handle more volume. For example, currently I am able to train my chest, back, and side delts with 30 sets per muscle group per week, no problem, because I improved my recovery capacity over months and months by incrementally increasing my volume. At the end of the day, how much volume you should do depends on how important maximizing muscle growth is to you, how much volume your body can handle, how much time you have, and your preferences regarding how much volume you actually enjoy doing.